I look crap and I know it. I haven't got time to look good. I couldn't if I tried. Alright then. News to hand. The Queen of the Zulu nation in South Africa has died 1 month after becoming queen. Her father, who ruled before her, ruled for 50 years, and then she gets in and dies inside a month. I kind of think this might happen to Prince Charles, if the Queen lives for long enough. The other Queen, the Queen of the English nation. Nation, that's a funny word. The Zulu nation inside the nation state, that's South Africa. My goddaughter and I have been talking about the difference between nations and states, and you have to keep your head loosey-goosey to get your head around that, because in Australia here, we are one nation. And yet we have many nations here in Australia, all the indigenous nations, and sometimes I start to think that there are new nations growing up, like the Black Nation, an indigenous black nation, spelled B-L-A-K, which is a different thing than all the individual nations that are the mobs, the indigenous mobs. You have to keep your head loosey-goosey. United Kingdom, for example, that's a state, isn't it? But it's got 4 nations inside it. The United States. That's a state of sorts, and yet it's the uniting of a number of states. That's interesting. And then you have what I really think is a black nation rising up, or forming, solidifying in the United States of America. And you have other nations there too, of course, the indigenous nations of the United States of America, which don't go back and back and back in the same way that indigenous Australian nations go back and back and back. And when did the indigenous mobs of the United States land there? Not so long ago. The Maoris in New Zealand, I think they landed really recently there. So the Maoris can't be compared to the indigenous Australians. I've gotten off track. The Zulu Queen has died 1 month after being crowned, not taking office. You take office in a state, I think, and you get crowned by a nation. I'll get lost if I start talking about nations and states again. And as I said, I think this might happen to Prince Charles if he's not careful. If the Queen lives to 110, the Queen of that other nation, what is she the Queen of? Well, she's the Queen of 4 nations, I think, at the moment. But watch this space. She's the Queen of Northern Ireland. She's the Queen of Scotland. She's the Queen of Wales. She's the Queen of Wales. She's the Queen of Wales, and she's the Queen of England at the moment. I think she might stay the Queen of England until she dies, and then Prince Charles might get in, and he might rule for a month. All right. So the Zulu Queen. Well, I'm finished. I was just mentioning that. This is a news update. This YouTube episode. But it is interesting. The Zulu, those nations even have a queen. Some nations have queens and some don't. Indigenous mobs don't have queens or kings. Greek nations, they don't have queens, or they don't like them. Kings and queens. The Romans didn't like having kings and queens. But other mobs, other nations, like most African nations, they tend to have kings and queens. And the barbarians tend to have kings and queens. All the Northern Europeans, they like having kings and queens. They're barbarians. Africans, they're barbarians. and they have kings and queens, but the sophisticated mobs, the sophisticated nations, like the Greeks, the Romans, and the indigenous Australians, don't have kings and queens. That's interesting. See, that could be a whole other episode there. I'm not sure whether you can call me politically incorrect in what I just said then, in what I said just then. Because in some ways I was very lefty there, wasn't I? And in some ways I was very offensive. That's a tricky one. That's the end of this episode.